We have several presentations this evening. The first is the business license update and proposed liquor license ordinance changes. Mr. City Manager.
Hi, good evening. Over the past several months, the team in community development has worked on several enhancements to assist with communication between the city and the EDC, some process improvements, as well as some updates on the website. So we'll present kind of where we are with those things tonight. And then we also have some proposed changes for liquor license process. So staff would present those and get some feedback from the council on those ideas. So I'll turn it over to Tom to present.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. As Adam said, my name is Tom Scannell. I'm the Community Development Director. And Becky, do I need to do anything for the presentations for the slides?
You'll actually share your screen from your device, Tom. In the top right-hand corner, there's a box with an arrow. If you click on that, then the options will come up for what screen you're wanting to share, and there you go.
Got it. So as Adam mentioned, we had kind of kicked this project off thanks to the mayor and Councilmember Steinmeier. We had several meetings with city staff as well as staff from the chamber and the Economic Development Council, and really focused on ways and strategies that we could seek to make the business license process easier for our businesses who want to locate here, but also to stay here. One of the messages that kind of came out of that was, hey, KC BizCare in KC Mo is doing a fantastic job. Let's kind of learn from what they're doing. So that sparked a conversation that staff had with KC BizCare. But one of the other ideas that came out from this discussion was the chamber and the EDC reaching out to some of the local businesses and gather feedback as well on our process. One of the things that we heard from KC BizCare was ease of use of your website and your documents that these businesses are going to use. So that was one of the first steps that we undertook, was a redesign of our business license webpage. We made it much easier to use, but also gave it a fresh look and had all of the information and documents that these businesses, whether they are applying for new business, would need to renew their business. And we freshened the whole website up and broke it out into different sections, again, for ease of use. One thing that also came out from this was we created a new business web page, and what we wanted to do here was provide a easy to understand new business requirement checklist, but also provide links and information where these new or small businesses could find information that assists them with their business endeavor. So moving on, I mentioned briefly about the new business checklist. This is something that we came up with. This is a little over 1 page, so very easy to use, has lots of information, lots of links to a variety of different sources that any new business can use, click on, get the information that they need, but also outline some of the process that goes through as far as issuing a new business license. What also kind of came out from this discussion was we made some enhancements to our food handler classes. Those were moved online. The old process, how we were doing in-person teaching of those classes, so was pretty difficult to undertake given the limited amount of resources that we had. Plus, so we found a partner technology that we could use that would offer these food handler classes in a variety of different languages. So we have English, Spanish, Cantonese, and many other languages, which prior to this, we were limited to the staff who had this capability. So that's been a huge success for us. Just having this dialogue really reinvigorated the communication between city staff and the EDC. We now have regular communication with them. It's good dialogue going back and forth. And so that has been a result of this. Kind of going back to the conversations that we had with KC BizCare and updating the forms, that has been done. We've simplified the forms. We had separate forms for almost every different type of application, and we've kind of condensed those down into one form that is much shorter, easier to use, and can cover a variety of different topics for any type of business. And the last bullet on this page that I want to spend a little bit of time on is the zoning clearance form. So this kind of came about from our discussion with KC BizCare. And this was something that in our process, we stumbled a little bit. But by having this zoning clearance form, so a business comes into City Hall, they say, I want to do X type of business. They would have to apply for that business license and take their chance of being approved or not. But the zoning clearance form allows them to take that worry and that headache out of knowing whether their business is allowed at that location where they want to locate before they actually apply for that business license. And that was something that we gathered from KC BizCare, and we will be rolling that out within the next couple weeks. And so we are really excited about that, to see how that works and how potentially that could save us a few days in the review of a business license. So those are kind of the updates on the business license. I'm going to pivot just a little bit and cover our liquor license requirement. So we started this project around the same time. We had seen over the years that our code was outdated. Our code dates from 1970, when Chapter 2 alcoholic beverages was enacted in the city code. So over the years, about 50 years, the city has passed 37 amendments to that. Most of those amendments were on single topics, changing one particular area of the code for one particular instance. And that created some duplicate and a lot of times contradicting regulations. So we undertook a comprehensive review of Chapter 2 and made significant changes to that. The first reading was last week, and we have the second reading coming up in next Monday. But the changes kind of focus around these 7 bullet points here: from reorganizing the chapter, updating the regulation, reducing the number of licenses, addressing Sunday sales and tasting permits, the license fees, process regarding change of ownerships and a liquor license, as well as the overall process. And I'll go into each one of those here, starting with reorganizing the chapter. And So the chapter was divided out into several different articles, and what they had several different regulations that said the same thing, but in different ways, and sometimes they contradicted. We consolidated those all into one article of Chapter 2. That was something that we saw when we were comparing our regulations to our surrounding communities. As I mentioned, we had made 37 amendments to our liquor code over the 50 years. For comparisons, in the last 10 years, the state legislature made 38 changes to sections in their liquor regulations. So they made more changes, the state made more changes to their regulations in 10 years as what we did in 50 years. And as I mentioned, as they make changes to their sections, some of ours were out of date, so we corrected those, and we added references to that specific state statute section. The other change that we made, and this one is kind of a big one, is we significantly reduced the number of liquor license types. Currently, we have 48 different liquor license types. Many of those didn't correlate to licenses that were offered by the state. We would typically hear, I'm applying for this license with the city. How does this relate to the license that I get from the state of Missouri? So what we did is we reduced the number of licenses to 23, and we related those directly to those licenses offered by the state. So someone who applies for a city liquor license should know exactly what type of license they need to apply at the state level. One other thing that we did within our code change is that we added general parameters for the different license types, for hours of operation, different activities allowed, whether they can have Sunday sales or tasting permits, and any other restrictions, such as the number of licenses that are allowed per capita for that type of facility. Sunday sales and tasting permits, we wanted to treat these the same way that the state of Missouri handles that. And the way that the state handles these is that these are add-on permits to your license. And so we followed that same suit. So if you are a restaurant and you are selling intoxicating liquor, and that's the license that you apply for, and say the council approves that, you can then seek a Sunday sales license administratively. That's how it's handled at the state level, and we wanted to handle that the same as well. Now, I will point out that there are a couple licenses that already include Sunday sales, and those two are focused on establishments that have the license that are selling only beer. At the state level, if you're a original package retailer or a retailer by the drink, that you're only selling beer, Sunday is already included in that. The next area that we focused on were license fees. Our current ordinance requires the full license fee when the application is made. So that could be anytime throughout the year. Keep in mind that our liquor license year follows the state, which is July 1 through June 30th. And so we modified our fee and prorates it based on when the application is made. So if you make your application before December 31st, you pay the full fee. The half fee is paid whenever an application is made between January 1st and March 30th. And then if we have an application that's made April 1st, between April 1st and June 30th, we charge the full fee, but we give the expiration date of that liquor license to the following year. So they get a few extra months with that in that last example.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. This is Karen DeLucci. Is there a reason we don't just make it like a year from the time I apply? I have it for a year. Is that a problem?
So the state offers their liquor licenses for this same time period from July 1 through June 30th. And we just follow that as well, or else someone may have a state license, but their city license is expired.
Okay.
And what we have found is every city in Missouri that we researched has the liquor license from July 1 through June 30th. So we did not propose to make any changes like that.
Okay. Thank you.
So the next area where we made a change is how we handle establishments where there is a change of ownership. Our current process requires any type of ownership change to get council approval. We had one recently, Saints Pub, where they had a 10% change in ownership, and that required council approval. What our proposed ordinance calls for is any changes of 25 or less can be administratively approved, but anything over a 25% change would have to get council approval. This is where we spent a great deal of our part looking at our process. As I mentioned, city council approval is required for all liquor licenses, including transfer of licenses, expansion of an existing premise, change of ownership. We also have in our current ordinance a 2/3 majority vote by the city council whenever the license is less than 300 feet from a church, a school, or a residence. It outlines that a public hearing notice is required. It doesn't specify the timing. It doesn't specify how that notification is done or how it's measured. So what our proposed process is we have city council approval only when the licensed premise is within 300 feet of a church, a school, or a residential property. And this would be a full public hearing, just like we currently have. But if the licensed premise is greater than 300 feet from a church, school, or residential property, this is something that the license could administratively be approved. We also made a couple other changes too. We looked at the wholesale and manufacturing license types. In our study of this, we felt this was more of a land use decision, and that if the zoning is already in place, that we should treat this license as just that, and those could be administratively approved. As I mentioned before, the Sunday sales is an add-on license instead of a different license type. And we also removed the 2/3 majority vote by city council when that establishment is less than 300 feet from residential, church, or school.
Can I ask you why, Tom? Why would you remove that?
I'm sorry?
I'm just curious why that would be removed.
In looking at our peer communities and at other cities in the state of Missouri, we were the only city that had that 2/3 majority vote for any license that was less than 300 feet from a church or school. The state does not require that. So we just thought that it's best not to have that in there.
So instead of 5-7, it would just be a 4-3 vote, or would it not even be a vote?
No, so by removing the 2/3 majority vote, it would just be the regular majority of the city council.
Thank you.
We also clarified the process. I mentioned a couple slides ago, it requires a public hearing, notices, and information like that. So we clarified the ordinance, specified a timing, 10 calendar days. We also specified the notification distance and how that is measured. And so we really cleaned up that part of the city code. So those were the changes that we made to the liquor code section. The next step is it will have its second reading next Monday, March 1st. We hope to bring to the City Council on March 1st a revision to the liquor license fee. So one other thing that we did is we compared our license fees to what the state charges, but also to what our surrounding neighbors charge as well. And so we're making a few adjustments to that, and we're bringing those fee changes forward on March 1st. And the thing that we will be working on next is revising our liquor license application. Again, in the theme that we took with the business licenses, we wanted to make it more simplified and clearer application. Our current form is 21 pages long and is quite daunting. And our hope is to get it down to something a lot shorter that is easier to use and clearer to use. So that concludes the presentation, and I'm available for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Scannell. Are there any other comments or questions from the council?
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilman Steinmeier.
Yeah, Tom, I just want to say I really appreciate you and your staff approaching this challenge the way you have. I think helping clear up some of the confusion that our application process, some of the charges, just updating the process it was a big task, and you have proven to be you've done a great job. You and your staff need to be commended. My question to you is, well, just because Councilmember DeLucci asked the question, people may not be aware. By the time a lot of the manufacturing wholesale get to the city, they've gone through federal background checks, state background checks. So there's been lots of process that have happened. So simplifying our process at the city level streamlines our ability to serve that business space a little better. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that was our hope too. That in doing our research, we saw that the state was doing such a background check into especially the wholesaling and the manufacturing, and the hoops that these businesses have to jump through is at a higher level than what a restaurant or a retailer of packaged liquor has to go through. So they're already going through some extra scrutiny. And from our standpoint, in the wholesale and the manufacturing, alcohol is not being consumed there. Right. In the wholesale application, it's business to business. So it's in our minds, it becomes more of just they're just using that, they're getting a license to sell to different businesses. Same with the manufacturer. They're manufacturing it, but they cannot sell direct to the consumer unless they have a separate license to do so.
Right. Also, Tom, just once we complete this process, I'm going to trust that we're going to do another deep dive into other permitting, business licensing, the costs, and I'd like to be involved in that and ask more questions about why we have some businesses that are required to have licenses, others are not. So is that something that your office plans to do?
Yeah, in fact, we just kicked it off last week. Our kind of our planning out of Chapter 5 is our business license section. We had our initial kickoff meeting just internally of how we intend to try to tackle that endeavor.
It's a great job. I appreciate your efforts. Like I said, I'd like to be involved in that. And if you can allow me the privilege of being a part of that, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Great job.
Tom, it's Karen again with more questions. And so the proposal is that all wholesale and manufacturing distributors of alcohol is simply going to be administratively approved. It's never going to come to council.
That's correct. Now, you may have a manufacturer that decides to sell their product where they manufacture it, and that would require a separate license, and that separate license would have to go to City Council for approval.
That license could be administratively approved if it was over 300 feet though, right? From a church or residential, or am
Correct.
I not understanding?
That's
Okay,
correct.
so the only time council is going to look at a liquor license is if it's within 300 feet of residential or church or a school?
Yeah, and when we did the analysis of that, pretty much every establishment on Nolan Road, 291, 23rd Street, 40 Highway, they're all going to require council approval. It's in Eastland where you start to get farther away from residential, and a few areas along 39th Street where you get far enough away from residential. So you're still going to have that review by City Council whenever it is within 300 feet of a church or school or residential. So,
and why 300 feet? Why not 500 feet?
We use some of the language that we had in our current ordinance that specified if it was within 300 feet of residential, church, or school, you had that 2/3 majority vote.
But it was still a vote. So we're proposing getting rid of a 2/3 majority vote, plus we're proposing getting rid of council review if something is 301 feet away from residential, churches, or schools.
Yes.
On the food handler permits, I know I've read something with the health department that a lot of our violations are simply that the food handlers, they don't have the permit there at the work, you know. So can we not put those online so that a business can say, here's all my food handler permits for this establishment, so that they don't have to worry about a piece of paper that a teenager forgets to bring with them to work? Is that impossible?
We can work with our vendor who offers that online to see if we can get that done. But I will say this, that a lot of times these employees who work at restaurants may have multiple jobs, and they may work at multiple food establishments, and they need that paper copy for each one. So, but we can at least look into that and see what is possible.
I think that would be a good idea. Maybe just a food permit handler subcategory where if DeLucci's working at Red Lobster and I'm also working at Salvatore's, anybody can look under my name to see that I have that permit, whether they're in, doing a health check on Salvatore's or on Red Lobster. It just makes more sense.
And we have that database, and that may be something that may need to be tweaked in the code instead of requiring that paper copy. As long as we have record that they have their food handler card, that should suffice. But not knowing what our current ordinance says, that we can at least look into that and see where we need to make some tweaks if necessary.
And Tom, my final question is, I've been overwhelmed with paper these past couple of weeks, and I easily could have missed this, but did you send out the proposed revision with the highlights and the strikeouts on this to the council? And if not, could you?
So what we did is we did a repeal and replace because that was the simplest to follow for everybody involved, because of the amount of changes of just reorganizing the chapter itself. It looked like everything was struck through, and it was very difficult to find out what was being kept and what was being removed. So we thought the cleaner method was to repeal it and just replace the whole thing. I will say this, that all of the items in Article 1, although they've been reorganized, it's a lot of what was there originally. It was just updated to remove the conflicts with state statute.
So did you send that stuff out or not?
No.
Can I stop by and look at it?
Yes.
Okay, I'll call you tomorrow. That's okay. Fine. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilman Huff.
I hope you can hear me. A few council members couldn't hear me the last few weeks. I was making sure I went out and bought me a new computer. I hope everyone can hear me this evening. And not looking at the top of my head. The federal law has changed a bunch on alcohol. They're lightened up on the breweries, the distilleries across the nation. They've done away with a lot of taxation and everything. And so I really appreciate Tom looking at what's going on here. I mean, we haven't looked at this thing in over 50 years, really. Something should be reviewed all the time. But my biggest question here is that the alcohol end of it that we talk about. Tom, has there been any kind of thing with the marijuana shops, marijuana shops within 300 foot of a resident or church or something? Kind of just wondering if everyone's being treated equal, because I'm sure that we have medical marijuana here, and that's fantastic, and I'm sure that recreation will be here probably within the next year. I'm just wondering if we have some guidelines in line with the alcohol type of deal, if we're working both ends of that.
So on the medical marijuana, that was an amendment to the state constitution that provided several parameters that cities could regulate the time, place, and manner of those establishments. And when we adopted our regulations concerning those, we followed those guidelines that the state had in. And we did the same with this liquor code change. We really wanted to tie our ordinances back to the state statutes, so hopefully that answers your question.
Well, one of my other concerns is not so much that we're doing anything against the state either way, because I consider the liquor license the same being against the state. If that's state law, this is a charter city, and so that we follow the state rules, I think, as part of our oath. But my main concern is, are we notifying, not so much that we're regulating, but we're notifying the residents or the businesses or the churches around the area for the marijuana. Just not that they can protest, change it, or anything like that, but they actually know that, hey, business is going in there. I mean, we do that with almost every business in the city, just making sure that, you know, we did notify the churches and everyone that, hey, you know, this is going to be going on here. We could have a lot more activity in this area. We need to stay within the state law. I just wondering if we were going to notify people the same way, not so much that they can have anything to say about it, but that at least they know.
So that's something that we could look into. You know, any liquor license that comes forward and is within 300 feet of residential, church, and schools, and triggers that public notice requirement, those property owners within 300 feet will be notified. So that would include churches or schools or residential property.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
So Mr. Scannell, on that, even I think that is important that people need to know what's coming into their neighborhood. This is a highly regulated industry, so I think that would be appropriate. And same holds true, as Councilman Huff said, as the medical marijuana. I know, you know, some of those rules are still being written at the state level. But although this was being proposed that this would not necessarily come to the council for a vote if it's outside of that range, people still have the opportunity to do a legal protest. Is that not? I mean, there is a process that people can go through for any type of zoning or issuance of a license. Is that? I presume that would still be the case, correct?
So the legal protest is a matter for zoning. As far as this liquor license goes, there is not a legal protest.
Okay.
However, if it is found that they are operating outside of what their license allows, or they are breaking other ordinances, such as serving to minors or things like that, the ordinance outlines the clear process for suspension or revocation of that license.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Is there anything else from Mr. Scannell on this topic? Okay, next we have the City of Independence Water Fund Resiliency and Cash Balance Policy. Mr. City Manager.
All right, so we have Chris Lover with PFM on the call this evening. They are our utility financial advisor. He's here to present the resiliency and cash balance policy for the water fund. This policy follows a very similar methodology and framework that we used for IPL and the City Council recently adopted. The PUAB received this very same presentation last Thursday and recommended approval of it, as well as utilizing the excess cash identified in the study for a main replacement program. So last week, the PUAB asked Chris to make a more abbreviated presentation, and given the other topics we have on the agenda tonight, if it suits the council, we would just kind of make a similar presentation and hit the high points and address any questions that you had at the end, if that works.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, it's all yours.
I should be sharing content. Can people see the presentation?
Yes.
Let's try it. Big screen here. So this is the second of 3 studies, and as was discussed, Public Financial Management is the financial advisor to the 3 utility systems. We serve as your fiduciary. I think a question that came up last time is how does this fit within the city charter? And when you look at the mandate of what's written about the utilities, there's a discussion there about a reasonable surplus of cash. And I think this type of study gets exactly to that type of answer, or at least a defendable and reasonable answer of what that level of cash is. I think I'll flip through a few slides here. And again, this follows a very similar framework as the IPL study does, where we look at revenues, expenses, working capital, as well as the capital reserves to get to an overall number of what we consider a target to be. And then we build a 10% buffer around that target. So one of the critical steps is looking at how much cash actually sits on the balance sheet. And if we go back to 30 June of 2020, the utility, the water department, had about $42 million in cash. But as you walk down all these accounts, you realize that a lot of it is not available. You have a debt service reserve fund, which you're required to have, and that reduces that by $3.6 million. You also have approved a bunch of construction projects and CIP-related projects, which total about $11 million. So we considered that unavailable also, since those projects are deemed still valid and a still valid requirement for the reliability of the system. So you subtract $11 million from there, and you walk through these other accounts, and lo and behold, your $42 million actually is much less. It's about $26.5 million. So that's about 35% of the cash is really unavailable. And as a reference, IPL was about 20% was unavailable. So a little bit higher number, and that's attributable to primarily the CIP projects that have been approved but not executed yet. Our next slide is a bit of a summary. You currently have cash on hand in that blue box. It says $26.4 million. And as we go through all these bins in this study, meaning revenue risk, expense risk, working capital, and capital, you total all those up, and that comes up to $15.3 million, which we should say is a reasonable level to keep on hand to address the operational and financial risks of the utility. That means based on the June 2020 number, you have about $11 million over this cash target. I think we could probably go through these slides or right off of the IPL slides, very similar. I would say the one thing that's interesting on the water department is that really we have these conservation measures that are in place. We have efficient appliances that are in place, and they're reducing the usage. And we also have customers' behavior who are really looking at to be more environmentally sound in their practices and day-to-day lives. We looked at all the costs of the system, and there's about 6 or 7 different categories we looked at. And even though we characterized, they're largely characterized as an O&M expense, operations and maintenance expense, the reality is that on a year-to-year basis, there's really a large fixed component of it, meaning regardless of the demand of the product of the water, basically you have a very stable level of expenses you have to cover. So we broke all your expenses into a fixed and variable component. We also added, as you can see in that third bullet there, the pilot debt service as well as your debt service coverage margin. So that's an additional $7.5 million. And just that number alone equates to about 160 days cash. So we basically say that you have about $24 million in a fixed cost base that needs to be addressed in any given year. We looked at loss of a customer, general sales decrease. This is a macroeconomic risk. And for the next few categories, you'll notice we selected this most conservative level, the one on the far right, meaning let's reserve more cash for this risk, and a few reasons for that. And it's primarily driven by COVID-19, and some of the uncertainty of the recovery we're going to have and the stimulus package. I think these things are coming into a cleaner light here as the vaccine gets rolled out. But I think, for the time being, I think we'll see how this develops, even as our country crossed 500,000 deaths today. So that's why we have the next couple risk areas to the far right-hand side. So we look at the macroeconomic risk, just shy of $2 million. We look at the loss of an individual customer. In this case, this is a wholesale customer. The interesting thing with your wholesale customers, this could be Lee Summit or Blue Springs as an example. And really, I think this bin represents conservation efforts. Some of these large wholesale customers of the utility have water contracts with other enterprises around the area. And those contracts have a minimum take requirement. So we could see the water department basically having to reduce its flow to those supported utilities since you have this minimum take amount. So we think conservation, this is kind of a measurement of conservation risk, which really sounds kind of oxymoronic, but as you have less flow, you have more cost to spread over a smaller base. And again, it's the right-hand side for conservation levels and for some COVID environment items. We looked at some of your other customers, such as Unilever and your top 10 customers. So there is some risk here, but for the most part, we believe it's addressed in the prior two categories. So I'd like to point out here, we didn't just go down the right-hand side and said, let's take the most conservative level. We made some judicious decisions of where the utility could accept some risk in terms of its cash balance. You have some off-system sales that are short-term contracts. We think there's a little bit of risk here because that does provide a profit margin for you. But again, we think it's largely addressed by the prior two big risk categories we discussed. I think as you start adding all these numbers up, we're starting to see our reserves build. I think currently we're about $3.5 million for our total reserves. Interest income, this is the same as with IPL. Again, we're not expecting a big heavy interest rate environment. Short-term rates are very low. So as the city reinvests their money, we're not going to have as much due to smaller returns. This is a similar category as we use for IPL. We then looked at the expense risk side. The interesting thing to me on this slide is that the orange line in the graph shows monthly use of electric power, so megawatt hours, fairly constant with a few spikes here and there. But the blue line represents the cost. And every year you're getting about a 5% increase in your electric rates. And those are essentially passed through to your customers. And depending how Evergy hedges those electric costs, those might be passed on to the utility in a quick manner. So we used some of the information from our prior study with IPL, and we said, well, there's some risk here with power costs, something we've seen in Texas, and I'm sure you've seen the headlines in Austin and Houston and San Antonio. But there's some risk here that you have some exposure to the power market.
I'm sorry, I've got to interrupt here. I don't understand why you're going with power and light and comparing these two together. Number one, we buy power. Part of this, we own the water here. And this is, I'm having a hard time understanding the comparison here. There's not a comparison here. So I'm totally lost.
Well, let me step back then. I think when you look at the revenue risk that we showed, let me go up a couple slides here.
So yeah, Chris, could you go back to that slide? I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood. If you can go back to that slide that shows the energy use with the orange and blue line. Is this demonstrating what the water department uses in electricity to pump the water?
Exactly. So it's requirements.
Okay.
Yeah, the requirements of the system to move the water around the service territory.
Okay, so it's not a overall comparison of electric rate to water. It's what the water department uses to deliver the water.
Exactly.
And electricity. Okay, thanks.
And the usage is relatively constant if you can draw an orange line through. And if you look at the orange line, it looks pretty flat. But the blue line is the actual cost. So all those costs get passed through to the water department, and in turn it gets passed on to your customers. Evergy typically has an adjustment mechanism to flow through the costs on a month-to-month or quarterly basis. So there might be instances where you have a sudden shock surprise, and those
Right.
costs go right
So-
down to the utility.
I think that's important for people to hear and understand that our water is on Evergy's system.
And if I may, I think the question came up about why are we going through some of these other bins? And I think it's just a reasonable methodology and a framework to examine what's the risk to the utility. This says general sales decrease, but think about this as an economic recession or macroeconomic risk, a slowdown in the overall economy. People using less water, but you still have a fixed amount of cost to pay. If you look at the next slide, this is more of a customer-centric risk, meaning not the overall economy, but what's going on in the supporting towns around you. And this third risk here is what's going on in some of the individual businesses. So you take into account essentially the whole economy, the bigger economy, whether it's regional, down to what's going on in the independents in the Kansas City Metroplex.
So do we, Chris, I'm sorry, do we, like, since we're doing all this comparisons and stuff, does the water company have the same like fuel adjustment situation as Power and Light does? In other words, if the cost of power to pump this water increases, is that part of your, and I don't know if it might not be any part of your deal, but does that affect the rates as far as like a fuel adjustment?
Meaning it's a pass through to the ratepayers of the city very quickly?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if Dan's on, if he could address that question on how quickly he's able to pass those through.
So yes, when there was if you had a cost of service study, we would include those costs. But in this case, like since the water plant is actually in Sugar Creek, which is an effigy area, so we're buying the utility, the electricity from that point. And so yes, we would pass those through the customers, but only with a rate increase. We would have to absorb them until we determined that we were going in a hole and have to do a rate increase. But they don't have a like a fuel adjustment charge on there, to answer your question.
Dan?
Thank you.
Dan?
Yes.
Evergy, don't they have to go through a regulatory agency for any rate change?
Correct. So all the rate increases they would have would go with Public Service Commission, since they're a private utility. So that's how those are approved, through the Public Service Commission. So anytime they would want a rate increase, I think what Chris was talking about is that you can see on that chart, it has a continually going up X% a year, like clockwork. So they don't miss a beat. If they have to pay more for energy, they will pass it along to us. And I think that's one of the things that has increased the most and so consistently increased, and that's what's showing up on your slide.
So I'm assuming then that we're not doing long-term contracts. If we're playing, we would definitely cover that so that we didn't see a customer increase.
Correct. Yeah, we're at their mercy as far as the power goes, but it's going through the Public Service Commission would be the approval mechanism. So if they want to raise rates to an industrial customer, now granted, we're a huge industrial customer, so we have much better rates than the average, residential customer per kilowatt hour, but that is how it's handled. It's through the Public Service Commission, and that's what we pay, and a gross receipts tax to Sugar Creek.
So are we passing the rate increases on to wholesale customers, or are we passing them on to residential, or are we splitting it?
Yeah, it's proportional to the cost of service study that's done whenever the rates were set up. So to answer your question, absolutely, the wholesale customers pay their cost on of the electricity, and that's no different than chemical cost or any other cost that we would to address our rates. But until we raise rates, we absorb the cost increases.
Okay.
So I think the point I wanted to make on this slide is that we were able to use some of the data in the table from the IPL study that talks about how volatile have power prices been. And that's what I just kind of want to point out there. We just didn't cut and paste this over from IPL, but we looked at what the usage was of the water department here and applied a framework of what the potential cost exposure could be. So power and pumping, one of the biggest expenses. We then looked at the other expenses. Chemicals is a big driver here. We basically said, what happens if we have some type of inflationary pressure? Again, the water department would have to absorb these costs until they get through their budget cycle. And here we felt that it's really not a big inflationary pressure yet. Maybe in the coming year or so it might be. The economy gets back on track quickly. And we just said, let's go with the less conservative route here for how many dollars we should set aside for this. So with these last two slides, we basically covered all the expense risk that we feel the utility is exposed to. Now, working capital, this is essentially your billing cycle and how many dollars do we put aside to account for the fact that it costs about $75,000 a day to run the utility. This represents basically pulling water out of the ground, putting it into the transmission and distribution system in the pipes, getting it to your house. You use it, all those costs are incurred, and the meter's read at the end of the month, and then that ratepayer has basically another 30 days to pay. So right there, you've accounted for about 60 days of float at the water utility where they've incurred the cost, but it's not getting paid. So 60, we'd say, would be the medium, the middle road here, just the least feasible one to use. In general, we like to see something a little bit higher, meaning 90 days, which gives you a little more cushion for one. And for two, I think when you look at some of delinquent accounts and this other data about the economic impacts of COVID and the unemployment in the region, it just makes sense to currently be over here on the right side for more conservative level. Our last area here is the capital plan and how much should we keep for a resilient system. And we looked at basically what's been executed. We've looked a little bit ahead. We looked at the accounting entries of what depreciation is by year for the past several years. And basically we said, let's go to the middle of the road here. So let's just take a moderate level. It accounts at least for the annual depreciation of the system. It also accounts for what you've been executing in terms of year-to-year plan. So I think when we add all these up, we get to that target of $15 million here with that blue arrow. And you can see we picked different risk levels along the way, not just going to the right because of the COVID environment, but thinking about what that true risk is and if there's some redundancy built in these categories that are addressed in other areas. Our next slide shows that you are over the target. So item 1 there is the amount of cash available. And number 2 shows you what the target and the bandwidth would be, the bandwidth being the range plus or minus 10%. And that basically means you have between, call it 9.7 and $12.7 million above the target. We also looked at, what is the perspective of your peer utilities around you, and what do they do for cash and days cash on hand. So this comes out to about 300 days, a little over 300 days cash. When you look at the folks surrounding you that have similar populations or similar operating revenues, or folks that you might hear about in the newspaper, you could see these water utilities have a much higher level of cash than we saw with IPL. And that's just kind of the nature of the water sewer industry. It's just more conservative peer group. And
Madam Mayor, I want to interrupt here.
Yes, go
First
ahead.
of all, you're making comparisons here. You're doing stuff here that we own the water company. These numbers here make no sense to me. We own it. So you're throwing all this stuff out here. I don't care about 200 days at Lawson. They don't own their water company. We do here. Our water is gold here, and people need to recognize that. And I just find this cash balance compared to utilities is just, it doesn't even, we're not there. So I'd like you to explain that.
Well, Lawton is a municipal utility in Oklahoma owned by the city, very similar to what IPL is. Sorry, what the water department is to the city of Independence. So these are all municipal utilities that are just like you. And you ask yourself, if we're going to recommend a level of cash, well, what does everyone else do? It's kind of looking around and seeing how you're doing against everyone in your class in some respects. So we wanted to make sure that as we run through this framework, are we coming up with an answer that's prudent and reasonable? And really, I think that's all this slide shows, is that your peers here, if you call them peers, have about an average of 400 days cash. And here we're saying our recommendation is going to put you about 300-ish, 318 to be exact. And that's still way below kind of what the average is. Because at the end of the day, this utility, the water utility, is going to come to the bond market at some point, whether it's for funding or whether it's to get some type of product, and folks are going to ask for your credit rating. And these banks or whomever, your counterparties, are going to say, well, how do you compare to other folks? And let's talk about days cash. So I think it's important to make this one comparison.
So there seems to be a really wide range here. I mean, all the way from 90 days in Des Moines to 800 days in Lee's Summit. If I'm glancing, kind of the high and low mark, I mean, that seems to be quite a 814 days in Lee's Summit seems like a awfully high number. I mean, why would that, and 710 in Kansas City, 793 in Overland Park. Can you just kind of shed some light on?
Yeah, I would say that you, for example, you take Overland Park, 793 days. They're AAA rated. That's a higher rating than the United States government in some respects. They're rated AA plus by Standard & Poor's. So there's a reason why they're AAA, and that's probably because they have close to 800 days cash. I think that, I'm not sure what it's there for, but it does seem a little bit high.
They don't own the water company though. That's the difference.
The other folks, such as Kansas City, 710 AA2, Broken Arrow 475 AA3, the Summit AA1, a couple notches above Independence Water here. So I think there's sometimes you talk to ratings analysts, they say there's a reason they're highly rated. It's because they have a lot of cash, and that typically also means very strong debt service coverage. But I think there's also no one size fits all.
Chris, I don't know if this is a question for you or somebody on our staff, but when I look at these cities that I'm familiar with, and I'm not familiar with all of them, they must have other funding sources to take care of their infrastructure. I mean, all the ones on here that I'm familiar with have some sort of other general obligation bond to take care of infrastructure needs that aren't coming out of the capital, that are supplementing their capital projects. Is that, is that something that potentially is impacting these numbers, that they have other funding sources besides just what's in their water department to take care of the capital and infrastructure needs?
I think in general, when I look at these folks, look at water and sewer, they issue utility revenue bonds for their own infrastructure needs. Okay. So I'm not sure they would have another source of funds.
Okay.
Well, Chris, you look at
Mayor, can I?
Thank Adam, go ahead.
So on here, the comparison for Overland Park, I think that is meant to say Water District number 1, not Overland Park. So that's part of maybe what's causing a little bit of confusion here.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, was there another question?
I was just
Yes,
looking at Columbia. I mean, it's close in population size, but they have $154 million, and that buys them 91 more days of cash.
No, that's
I mean-
the operating revenue. So in terms of size.
Okay. So they're much bigger than we are. I guess I don't understand how their operating revenues are so much higher. What are they doing?
Well, I think that would take another analysis. You can see their population is slightly larger, but not materially larger. So I think we just have to delve into it. I mean, it probably just means that their rates are 3 times or 5 times what your rates are. And in some instances, when you look at the financials, they merge the water and sewer system. So you're going through a financial statement that says this is the water sewer enterprise, and it might not be broken out as cleanly as the way Independence does it, where you can just go in there and look down one column and see water and then water pollution control.
Chris, did you look at in terms of water loss that we have in this city and what it costs our city in terms of what percentage that we pump that's unaccounted for? Do you have any numbers on that?
We did not look at that, the pumped but not billed ratio. In general, that's incorporated into, unfortunately, the rates of the folks who do have meters and who are usually ones paying the bills, but usually it goes to like fire hydrants and sometimes the loss in the pipes over time. But it's something that if you wanted to research that, I'm sure we can go through, and that's usually an item in the disclosure of these other utilities where you can find a table in their documents that are posted for investors. Say here's what their kind of water loss is, or the pumped versus billed ratio.
Dan, do you know the number? What percentage is pumped and unaccounted for?
Yes, ours range is closer to 15%, which is a little high for utilities. You shoot for 10%. And I think that's what we were trying to address when we talked to the Public Utility Advisory Board about the fixing the mains that we have. We're not replacing the mains at the rate to replace them. So that's why they had made a recommendation to spend any excess money on main replacement program. So the answer to your question is yes, ours is a little higher than usual, and it's a little deceiving because we wholesale half of our water. So we pump it out of the plant. So the number is actually would be considered much higher than the 15% because half of that water is going into meters at the wholesale really quick. And we're not, that's the loss we have, but most of that loss is probably in the 750 miles of mains in our residential neighborhoods, that type of thing.
There's no further discussion on the comparable utilities.
Okay. I think we'll, I'm sure look at that a little closer, but you can continue with your presentation.
Well, I mean, it is sometimes difficult to as you're going through these disclosure documents and annual reports, no one really bins it all the same way, but where we've been able to identify the water utility, we put that in there. And I do think some of these might be the combined water sewer enterprise.
Okay.
The rating agencies, essentially, if you tell the rating agencies you're $11 million over your target and we're gonna do something with those dollars, sometimes they might not react well to it. But I think if you have a policy in place such as this policy, they view it as a reasonable action, meaning it's a thought about the risk the utility faces, and that seems prudent. So I would say there's no real risk to the rating of the utility if you move to this target. Again, recommended level 15.3 million. You have about $11 million over that with $26 million, and you have several options. You can see, I think it's about the 5th bullet down there. You could pay off some of your 2013 bonds with cash. You could put that cash into a refunding transaction into the future. You could address some of your CIP and reliability needs in the future, so you can reduce some of the rate pressures that you might have had to put in place. And you can also do the rate adjustment, kind of a one-time rate adjustment also. And in terms of a refunding, this is the next opportunity for the water department. It will be in the fall of 2023, so a bond transaction in the spring and summertime to get ready for it, ideally, and some dollars can be put against that, or it can be addressed through some other debt issuance.
Chris, it's Karen DeLucci with a question.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
I don't know if you would know the answer to this or not. The interest rate on the callable bond is 3 to 5%. Are we closer to the 3% or are we closer to the 5%? Do you know which one we're paying?
I think we're closer to the 5%. So you have several maturities of bonds, some of them have 3% coupons and some of them have 5. I think you're closer to the 5 than the 3.
And do you happen to know if we went ahead and, I think you people call it defeasing the bond, and use this excess funds to help defease this bond and reissue debt, do you know what the interest rate would be, what we're looking at today versus 3 to 5%?
Yeah, I think we ran the numbers on that. I think you could probably be in and out of the market at about 2.5%. And there are other tools you can use to lower that, meaning if you put dollars into the transaction, you could probably get it lowers the effective borrowing rate.
It'd be cheaper to borrow the money. Is that what you mean?
Well, it's a very good environment to borrow money right now with rates as low as they are. But every dollar you can put into the transaction out of the water department's funds, that it improves the savings and effectively lowers your rate. So you would basically identify the best, most efficient bonds to defease with cash, and then the other bonds to use debt to refund.
I understand. Thank you very much.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Councilman Huff.
Yes, I have plenty of questions on that little deal right there. Chris, you was involved in the IPO, cash reserves and everything. I know back before this, a lot of these members on this council were involved. The city finance director at that time decided to get rid of FERC accounting and use that to leverage all the city's debt. It seems like we're rolling back down that road with this one here. Do you have anything on that as far as I mean, you're talking about lower rates, and I know that was used to do that for citywide, and that's why FERC accounting went away. It wasn't because they didn't have people there to do it. It's because they wanted to change that interest level. So is that what you're talking about here?
Well, I think you have a refunding transaction, so it's just like refinancing your house down the road, and it seems like it's an opportunity to save money for your ratepayers, for one. For two, I always look at it and say, what's the better use of this? If you consider $10 or $11 million over the target, what's the best use of that? And sometimes when you parse it down to the individual bill, it comes out to like a cup of coffee from Starbucks. Whereas when you aggregate it up at the utility level, you can defease $10 million of debt and pass on some decent rate decreases, or at least improve some of the issues with the system, whether it's capital improvements or construction projects. But a lot of times that's a very local decision where, I think you guys are more in tune with what your ratepayers want or expect.
One other thing I want to throw in here, you mentioned a minute ago about combined reserves. And so I'm looking at $67 million for power and light. I'm looking at another 15 for water. And then I'm going to get into water pollution control or sewer, whatever. Now we're looking at $100 million in reserve that no one's ever touched in the history of the city of Independence. And so I'm really concerned about why these numbers are so high. I understand that, we have some issues out there, but I think, we went from 25 million at Power and Light to 67 million. I think this is a really overkill, being that we own that utility. Electric's a little different because we don't produce any electric in this city. And so we are at the mercy of everyone else, but we do own the water company here, and we do own the sewer department. I'm just wondering, when you said that about combined reserves, have you put that into your equation that maybe we could do a $67 million and that all these other utilities would be, or enterprise funds would be in with that? Or is this I'm kind of lost on that end of it.
I think that might be difficult to do for a few reasons, because we look at this as each system has its own fund and each one has its own rating and each one borrows under its own revenue stream. So I can't really think of too many examples where they would do a combined reserve given some of the legal restrictions you might have. Now, what I will say is I put the chart back on kind of this green box summary here, and a lot of times we're on this right-hand side because it's this COVID environment, and you might say as you go to the budget cycle next year or the year after, maybe it makes sense to move towards the moderate levels, and that will free up some more of these reserves.
You mentioned yourself personally that a lot of these cities that you was looking at earlier that have combined services, sewer and water. That's what I'm asking you. So why in this situation that we're making them separate when you actually 10 minutes ago said that a lot of these people put them two together? That's what my concern is there.
Well, they operate as one system, the water sewer enterprise, basically. So the revenue from the water and sewer system goes to basically pay the bills and pay off all the bonds and the debt. So they're designed from the get-go to be one system, even though it's water and sewer. So some of these cities will have water, sewer, and then the electric utility, and they're just kind of separate. Some folks just, for whatever reason, like to have their water and sewer as one collective, business unit run by one general manager versus two different general managers, and they combine the revenues, but that's not the case.
So do you think that's a good idea for this city? I mean, you're the expert here. I'm asking you, are we better off combining all of these reserves into one? I realize there's different pools of money, but you're the one suggesting this, that it might work. I'm just asking for your professional opinion on it, if you think that would be a good deal for these citizens of Independence. I mean, we have a lot of money sitting out here that they are the stockholder here and they deserve their money. And it seems like that we just keep increasing all these funds. And then you mentioned, you yourself mentioned combining reserves. So I'm just asking that question. Do you think that's feasible, or would you think that would be something smart for this city to do?
I think maybe it can be looked at, but I think there's some legal hurdles to it. Is really what it boils down to. Legal, like maybe the charter of the city or the statement of accounts and the waterfall of revenue, and just how kind of the nuts and bolts of the legal requirements that you have.
Thank you. I'll let you keep going with your presentation. I won't interrupt you.
Chris?
Mr. Lover, this is Dan Hobart. I had a quick question. We had and maybe this is a question for Dan Montgomery too, but I was just curious if your cash balance number, is that from last June? As you know, in the interim, we had a ransomware attack that stunted our utility billing for a couple of months. And I know probably a number of people have, due to IPL too, but a number of people have gotten on payment plans. I didn't know if you knew, or if Dan Montgomery knew, how that would have affected or could have affected our current cash balance.
I know from my perspective, our goal was to keep everyone on the same timeline. So we didn't want to show you IPL in a December date versus June date versus October date. So when talking with the finance department and the water utility, we basically said let's kind of base these together so that it's kind of apples to apples off of the most recent financials that people can see see and know about. But I think I don't know if the general manager has an opinion on what the impact would be here for the ransomware and what those balances would be.
So the reserves, obviously, that's where the reserves would come in to carry us through that, Mr. Hobart. And so it's just spreading it out over a lengthier amount of time. Obviously, if some of them made payment arrangements for 3 months, then we will get the cash later. You know, as a rule, we normally collect, I think it's like 99.9% of the actual billing. It just may not come in the time frame that we're talking about now because everything's been extended out. But in the long run, we will come out because the average person, we have deposits to cover, you know, transient people that move in and out and leave town. But if they stay in town, then we will go ahead and collect that money later at some point in time.
Mr. Montgomery?
Yes.
Just a quick question on that. You know, I saw that in a special interest newsletter they sent out that that IPL was somehow in the red because of the delayed billing and the ransomware attack and all the things that were happening, yet water and sewer were in the black. Was that accurate?
Well, I'm not sure exactly the source of the information, but when like if $100 comes in and 70% of it's power and light, they will get 70% of the $100 that come in, and 10% of it's ours and 15 is sewers, or whatever the case may be. The amount, whatever comes in, it's spread exactly according to what the bill was. So I'm not sure what that information that you were bringing forward. I'm just not familiar with that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was just in a newsletter that was sent out by a group here in town that showed that IPL was running this huge deficit in the red, but yet water and sewer were in the black. And I just, you know, with all the billing and all the issues that we were having, how that could be possible since it's all one billing system. I was just curious if that was accurate in your opinion. Was that really what took place?
And again, I can't answer that. The finance department would know more about whether there's other factors other than just collecting the bills as to whether somebody's in the red or the black, but that'd be a finance question.
Okay. Well,
if I may, Councilman, could I try to address your question real quick?
Sure.
I think over the financial statements that will be coming out over the next few months for all the utilities will bear out the effect of billing and some of the other measures that have taken place over the last 60 days or so. Delayed billing, delayed shutoffs, those types of things. So the financial statements coming out, over the next few months will show how that really impacted us.
Well, and I appreciate that. I think we need to have some transparency because when you see information like that out there, it leads to some real questions on, how is this possible that one utility is running such a huge deficit, yet water and sewer were just fine. So it raised questions with me, and I think it should raise questions with all of us how that was possible. Mr. Montgomery, I want to ask you in terms of what Mr. Lover's been saying. My concern is shared. I share the same concern with Councilmember Huff. We're approaching $100 million that we're going to sit in a reserve, as Councilmember Huff has said multiple times, reserves that we have historically never touched. This is ratepayer money that we're just going to put over here to the side. And I just wonder, do you find that we need $15 million sitting in a reserve fund that has never been used, and a collective of almost $100 million? Does that sound reasonable to you?
That's why we're relying on the experts, because that's way out of my league as far as the finance department would be controlling that. That's not a concern that I'm just not equipped to answer that question.
It just makes me wonder, what are we planning for here, guys, that we need $100 million sitting in a reserve? What is it that we're planning? What major event and catastrophe are we planning for that we have to have $100 million in ratepayers funds? I I'm at a loss. I still don't understand how and why we're at this point with this discussion on reserves.
I have one comment since if you look at events, so the whole idea of the cash reserve resiliency study is just to not account for every single risk, but to account for a lot of the risks that any utility faces. And I think, you know, some of these things are fairly reasonable. You look at, you know, macroeconomic risks, a lot of the drivers of how we get to these numbers are your historical data, whether it's IPL or the water department, water pollution control. These are historical variations that have been experienced by the utility itself. So it's not like the numbers are you know, fabricated in many instances. It's really coming from your data. So we try to really focus it on your operations, whether it's financial operations or the actual nuts and bolts of delivering the product to your customers. I would say the other thing is that you know, there are certain things that will arise that you just can't plan for. And if you look down south to you in Texas, we have some utilities saying they experienced $300 million in excess bills because of natural gas and power prices over a 4-day span. So there's certain things that will arise, you know, that you can't really account for, or this helps you at least get in that direction. Now, can you say those risks won't happen to independents? Well, I think, you know, that's kind of a decision for the collective group here. But, you know, I think that when you look at the overall levels we're recommending, I think they're justified, for one. And I think for two, if you just think in a year or 2 years down the road, and you could see some of these ones migrating from the COVID more conservative level to the more moderate level, and you really can start freeing up certain, you know, quantities of cash that can go benefit pay off of debt or back to your ratepayers or capital. So I think right now we're in a situation where, you know, things are a little precarious, and I think that we're rounding the bend on a lot of it, but we're still not out of the woods.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, you're an analyst that looks at the historical risk. You said so. So when you look back 25 years of us having a reserve, how many times have we used it?
Well, I think when you talk about the working capital and dollars in, dollars out, that's something that happens on a month-to-month billing cycle basis for a lot of this.
I understand, but I'm just asking you, did you look at historically how many times that the city has had a need to dip into the reserves? And if Councilmember Huff is correct and we have not, then, you know, increasing them astronomically just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know who's assessing the risk. Is it you? Is it each department head? Who's assessing the risk?
Councilman Steinmeier, let me jump in here. I think this is a valid discussion. This is a policy decision, certainly, as to what we want our reserve to be. And I will take this opportunity to say we have not had financial policies for our utilities. We did not have financial policies for our general fund until just a few years ago. So I'm happy that and I think we're doing our customers and our citizens a great service to have that discussion and to develop those policies based on some input and information. I mean, I certainly think we all agree that it's important to have some cash on hand in case of emergency, although most of our emergencies when they come to utilities are caused by natural disasters, for which we ultimately over time can be reimbursed for those expenses, but we oftentimes need to pay them up front and then be reimbursed if it is the case of a natural disaster, which, you know, we've certainly seen, or weather related. But I think, you know, these are policy decisions. We have our consultants to help us guide us in gathering the information. But I think this is a discussion that we have begun and not completed in terms of developing these policies for all of our funds.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
So that's what I feel like a study session is about. And so I feel like that Mr. Lover, Mr. Montgomery, and everyone should be answering these questions, because there's a few council people out there that don't think they get enough information. So we're going to make sure they have plenty of information to make a decision here. And this is the best time, because evidently this is going to come up here in the next week or two to vote on. So I think it's very important that people understand that this money is the ratepayers, the citizens of the city. And you know me, I am a very big advocate of giving back to this city. And I think this is ridiculous that we're going to put $100 million back by the time this thing is through at a no risk at the water company. Really, this is like gold. You know, they can play the game with the power and light. That's fine. You know, we're at everybody's mercy. But this water company, we own it. It is gold. And we continue to give it away, in which we have voiced our opinion. Not so much this council, but the previous council. This is gold. And for someone to sit there and tell me I need $15 million in reserve is ridiculous. If these people don't want to pay, then you shut the meter off, and we'll see how long where are they going to get their water then. I mean, this is totally absurd that we're looking at $15 million at a very, very money-making deal. I mean, if as far as I'm concerned, the city of Independence, the citizens should be getting their water for free. We can sell this at a very high market value. And we're giving the money, we're giving our water away, and we have someone come and tell me I have to give that to reserve 15 million. I'm just totally lost. No disrespect to you, Mr. Lover. I'm just beside myself that we even come up with numbers like this.
I appreciate the study that PFM has done, and I think it's fairly professional. Mr. Huff and I may disagree on that. You know, there's nothing stopping any council member from finding a different calculation and making their own comparisons and coming up with another equation. Until then, just saying, I don't like the study and I don't like the numbers, that's not reasonable or rational. That doesn't help the ratepayers. That doesn't protect their money and their investment. So, you know,
you're exactly right. So you should be looking out for the ratepayers in this city and not your special interest group.
I am. I
Mr.
listen to the experts.
Do you have more on this presentation?
No, ma'am. I think that's
okay.
That was it.
So, Mr. City Manager, maybe I just so everybody's clear on what comes next after this presentation that has now been given to the PUAB with their recommendation to the council, and now this presentation to the council. What are the where do we go from here in this process?
So our plan was to model the same approach that we took with the policy for IPL, and we would bring back a draft policy for the council to consider and vote on. It probably wouldn't be next Monday, but two council meetings, 2 weeks from Monday, I guess, would be when we would bring a draft policy back for consideration.
Okay.
And I think, you know, the approach we took with the IPL study included really just kind of targets and risk factors without any numbers in it. And then the numbers would be developed as part of the annual budgeting process. And I think that served us well, and that would be the path we would follow here.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any further questions for Mr. Lover for our staff on this presentation?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I did have a couple of other questions.
Go ahead.
I noticed in this presentation about Flint and COVID, and so I had a few questions about that. as far as what value you tied into that would be one. If you could answer that.
Sure. I think that the biggest issue is just reputational risk, and it doesn't, it can take some kind of small decisions that become a big problem. And when you're providing an essential service such as water, the room for error is very, very small with that. And you look at what happened in Flint, and those are, if you've read the studies and read the papers, it was some folks trying to figure out a cheaper way to get water, and then they changed their chemical mixtures around, and it created a huge problem that led to a cover-up. But those are some small decisions that led to a huge restructure of the entire water industry up in Michigan. So that's just the point. There's not a lot of margin for error when you're providing an essential service such as water.
Right. And was the CIP validated prior to the model development?
We looked over the CIP projects, the list, and they seem reasonable to us, but I'm not sure where that stands with the new city, whether they're going to go reprioritize them or how it fits into the next budget cycle.
And I got numerous. I've been writing these down. How were the levels of risk established?
You mean less conservative versus moderate versus
yes.
more? Well, I can show you here. Let me go back to the economic recession one. Okay, so we looked at. I know I went back a slide, but we looked at all the expenses that the utility faced over time. We broke these into the components of fixed versus variable. We then looked at the other fixed expenses, pilot, debt service, your coverage. We added those up, and we said basically that's a fixed cost base you have to pay no matter what the volume of water delivered is. And then we said what happens if you have some type of variance. So this is a sales reduction. And we labeled it here 2%, 6%, and 8%. And why did we pick those numbers? Well, that's what we saw in 2014 for the less conservative level. Moderate level is what was 2015's actual reduction. And then the last one, of course, 2009. And then we can basically do the multiplication there, 23.9 times 2% times the period of coverage, which is 1 year. And that gets you to that bottom line number in gray. So it's all a math calculation. And virtually every single risk area follows that same mathematical foundation in some way.
Sure. Let's back up to the CIP. Did anyone validate that?
As I mentioned before, we saw the list of projects. They seem reasonable to us. And my understanding is that they were approved by the city council with the past few budget cycles.
Okay. And did this hacking or any utility ongoing issues have any influence on this capital development?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I have no other questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions on this presentation? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Lover. If it's okay with the council, I would like to skip number 3 and come back to it and let our Law, who's with us tonight, move on to number 4. I think this should be a fairly brief discussion. I don't want to keep them any longer than necessary. So if there's no objection, hearing none, we'll go on to number 4 and then come back to number 3. Mr. City Manager?
Sure. So a special counsel to the city, Sarah Carnes, was asked to provide a summary of the court case of the City of Independence versus Russell Pearson. This is referred to as the Bondurant decision. This is provided for City Council's discussion, and I think Ms. Carnes is here to address any questions you have.
Okay, thank you very much. As she's getting ready, the council may recall I had requested that Ms. Carnes provide us, or that our city attorney and then Ms. Carnes provide us with just a summary of the Bondurant decision. It's something that we reference quite often in this city in many contexts, and I wanted to ensure that we all had a clear understanding of what the Bondurant decision says, so that we can use this document as a reference both for our council, our boards and commissions, and our staff moving forward. So I asked her to, this was provided to all members of the council, all members of the PUAB. It's a public document made available to anybody who'd like to view it. So the purpose of this evening is simply to review it, answer any questions, make sure that we are all in agreement with the summary of this document so we can use it as a reference moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Carnes.
Good evening, Mayor and members of the council. Like everyone said, I'm Sarah Carnes. I'm with Lawburn Municipal Law. In your packet is a copy of a memorandum which summarizes the City of Independence versus Russell.
Just a moment. Hey, yeah. Can we remove this previous presentation from the screen so we can see each other?
Hey, Chris, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, continue.
Okay, yeah. So, like I said, in your packet is a copy of a memorandum which summarizes the City of Independence versus the Russell W. Pearson et al. Court decision. This decision is commonly referred to as the Bondurant decision, commonly and lovingly. It's named after Judge Bondurant, who actually heard and decided that case. I'm going to give you just a quick kind of summary, and then obviously if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. There were four main points of contention that were discussed in this decision. The first one was the Power and Light funds paying for services provided by various city departments. The court stated that these inter-fund charges to Power and Light Department for services provided by the city departments were allowed, but they had to be reasonable and actual. The second main point was electric power was being supplied without charge to the various city departments. The court stated that supplying power to other city departments without charge was clearly operating the electric utility for the benefit of other municipal functions and therefore was not proper. The third main point was the Power and Light Department was contributing funds for a new municipal office building. Again, these contributions were a direct benefit to other city departments and therefore were also improper. The last point of contention was regarding the payments being made to the city based upon the gross revenue of the Power and Light Department. The court stated that the charter allowed for these types of payments. We call them payment in lieu of taxes, and these payments have to be the same types of taxes that were on private businesses. Say that again. So the payment amount in lieu of taxes have to be the same as are normally placed upon private enterprises, just like the Power and Light Department. So the real main takeaways, there's two. The Power and Light Department is operated for the benefit of the ratepayers, not the taxpayers. And also the Power and Light Department may not be operated for the benefit of any other city department. So that's kind of the very short summary. Again, the larger, more detailed summary is in your packet. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for Ms. Carnes? Comments?
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. Sarah, thanks for doing this for us tonight. I've heard people say, well, that was a long time ago. This has been something that's been out there for what, 51 years, about right? Something
No.
like that. No, 41 years. 41 years. Okay. Well, since Moby Dick was a minnow, let's just say that. But so this judgment, you put in here, it's a declaratory judgment. I mean, is it? So there's no time restrictions on this or constraints. It's still standing, correct?
Yeah, it doesn't expire. It still stands.
So to take any other action against this, we would have to go back to court. Is that right?
To the four main points. The four main points that I talked about. So if you were to say, if the city wanted to start using power from IPL and not get charged for it,
yeah,
obviously that would be in conjunction with this decision, and you would most likely have to go back to court to get that changed if that's what the city so chose to do.
Okay.
So that's kind of, the 4 main points are kind of where that's what the decision says. That's what it's saying. So.
Yeah, I was just confused on it. So if there's points of it that we may think may not necessarily be correct, we would have to go back to court to challenge those points, correct?
I believe if you wanted to have a different interpretation that's not in that decision, then, and you wanted a court to say so, then yes, you'd have to go to court.
Okay. Oh, that helps me. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments? Okay, are there any objections or disagreements to Ms. Kern's summary of this court decision? Okay.
Madam Mayor, the Bondurant decision speaks for itself.
Yes. Councilmember DeLucci, I agree with you, but I think that over time things get, when we don't have a clear document to reference, then people get unclear about what it may or may not say. So I appreciate.
I believe it's on the website. I think when Sarah was our city lawyer, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Sarah didn't put it on the website when she was our city lawyer. No,
I couldn't
okay.
find it.
So
I couldn't find it, but
then I suggest we do that.
Yes. So now it is, and we're, unless there's some other comment, we are all in agreement with what it says and the summary that Ms. Kearns has provided.
I'm not agreeing by rote. The case is what it is, and if it comes to litigation, then the court can decide it. So if you're trying to use this as proof that I've agreed to Sarah Carnes's memo in full, that's not happening.
No, Councilman, that's not what I'm asking. The PUAB asked us to bring this forward to the council and to say, we've seen it. It accurately describes what the Bondurant decision made. It's certainly open to interpretation, just as any point of law or many other things. So I'm not asking for an endorsement of it. I'm just asking if there's any disagreement with the memo that Ms. Kearns has provided.
It's my understanding that Sarah is the counsel for IPL and usually attends PUAB meetings. I mean, I'm obviously she works for a very well-respected law firm in municipal law. So, I mean, she can certainly deal with individual issues as they come up. I don't understand.
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
As far as I'm concerned, we have a couple of attorneys on this council, but to me, this just seems like it's a Reader's Digest of what the thing reads. The document says instead of 20 pages, she condensed it down to a couple things there that were pertinent to what we're talking about. Instead of reading the whole document, it's a Reader's Digest. I don't understand. No one's approving or disapproving. It's just a Reader's Digest.
And as I said, the document speaks for itself. The Bondurant decision was decided based on the facts, and we have a legal decision. It's the law of the case. You don't appeal it. The time for appeal has gone. If this council votes or does something that a citizen disagrees with, that the citizen believes violates the Bondurant decision, they can sue us with or without Ms. Carnes' summary. I mean, the summary, I appreciate your work, Sarah, but a Reader's Digest is not the book. So I think we've got to look at the book. Thank you.
Have you read it lately?
I'm not answering questions of you, Mr. Huff.
That's Councilman Huff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Carnes. If there's no other questions or comments, we'll move on to the update of process for refunding of Cracker Neck Creek related debt. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you. So there's a team of professionals that's on the call tonight that has been led by the Director of Finance Administration, Brian Kidney. They've been working on this for several months now. I'll defer to Mr. Kidney to introduce the team and kick things off.
Sure. Thank you, Adam. All right. So I do want to point out, so the presentation tonight, it originally stemmed from the Audit Finance Committee. They've been asking to review all the outstanding debt of the city, and very specifically the economic development debt. Recently, the committee asked for an update of all the outstanding debt for Cracker Creek development. And then during that discussion, they pointed out that there's been 3 new council members since the last time we gave a summary or an update on the status of Cracker Creek, the debt and the financing. So we thought this was a good time to bring up an overview, and so that's what the purpose here tonight is. So we have a presentation together. So Tom Calico is a principal with Baker Tilly, who is our municipal advisor for economic development debt. And he's going to go through and give a quick update of the status of the outstanding debt for Cracker Creek, and then also what the plan of refunding that debt is. The second part of the presentation is part of the plan of financing is to establish a sinking fund that takes city revenues or tax revenues from expiring and expired TIF districts. And as they expire, they would go into a sinking fund in order to make payments on, or make sure that the payments are made for the refunded Cracker Creek bonds. And so Tom will also talk about that and review that draft with you. And then finally, in your agenda packet this evening, we had a draft of the preliminary official statement. And that is the document that, as you've been in bond issue, or we've had bond issues before, that's the information packet and the information that we send out to the market about the debt security itself. And our bond counsel on this transaction, Dave Martin with Gilmore Bell, will take that part of the presentation and talk about those sections of the official statement that has certain disclosures that we felt was important to review with the council. And then finally, I want to mention that we have Vanessa Eckert on the call also. She's vice president with Goldman Sachs, and I believe some of her team members are on the call also. And they're the underwriter that the city has contracted with to actually perform the refunding debt. So with that, Tom, I'll turn it over to you. Since we have multiple presenters, I will share my desktop and hopefully be able to follow along when they tell me to change the slide. So.
All right, great. Thank you, Brian. Madam Mayor, members of the council, good to be with you this evening. As Brian alluded to, my task this evening is to give you an update on the refunding of a certain series of Cracker Creek redevelopment district debt. Next slide, please, Brian.
See, I already messed up. There we go.
So what I'll do this evening is briefly is to talk about what we're planning to accomplish, how we will accomplish it, and some of the keys to success to coming out with a successful financing, which will include the TIF sinking fund policy that Brian alluded to. Then I'll hand it off to David Martin to take it home through action items and disclosure. Brian? So this graph illustrates the current condition, the condition that we seek to cure through this refunding of certain debt obligations related to Cracker Creek. The green line is the projected revenues. The bars are your annual debt service. And as you can see, we've got some years where we have an imbalance, right? We have debt service that is in excess of the projected revenues. So that is the condition that we seek to cure. The financing goals are really quite simple. We want to create a long-term plan for the repayment of Cracker Creek debt obligations. And I want to stress the word plan there because it truly is a plan. We are talking about future conditions going out a number of years. The future is always uncertain. And it's important for this to be a plan in that it is something that's reviewed regularly and revised as needed. We want to minimize the impact on the city's general and special revenue funds and ultimately strengthen the city's credit rating, which has long-term benefits, obviously, for all of your citizens. The good news is we are contemplating doing this refunding at a particularly beneficial time. Municipal bond interest rates are extremely low. To orient you a little bit on this graph, you've got interest rates on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis. These are years of maturity. So 1 indicates a 1-year maturity bond, 2 indicates a 2-year maturity bond, et cetera. The gray bars indicate the range that the interest rates for each of these maturities have spanned from 93 through February, through earlier this month. And the black dots are the average during that period of time. The green dots, all the way down at the very bottom of each of the bars, are recent rates. They've changed ever so slightly since this chart was prepared, but still basically in the same area. So you can see that rates are sitting at near or at historical lows. And why is this? Next chart, please. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the main one is that there is an imbalance right now between the supply of municipal bonds and the demand. The demand for municipal bonds right now is currently greatly outstripping the available supply. The black line in this graph indicates the net supply, and you can see that with a couple of instances, essentially for the past year, you can see we've been in a negative territory, meaning that the demand is, as I said, it's outstripped supply. Next. For this finance team, the city has assembled, or for this financing, the city has assembled a team of specialists. Gilmore and Bell is the city's bond counsel, doing a number of things, but primarily focusing on legal authority and taxability and tax status of the bonds. Baker Tilly is the city's municipal advisor, your fiduciary looking towards the city's interests in this financing. Goldman Sachs, as alluded to a moment ago, is the underwriter. They are assisted by their underwriters council of Armstrong Teasdale and Orrick, Harrington and Sutcliffe, and UMB is the trustee on the transaction. Next. There are 5 series of bonds currently outstanding that funded Cracker Neck Creek improvements. Out of those 5, we are targeting 3 for this refunding and restructuring. Those series are the 2006B, the 2013A, and 2013B. If you add the outstanding principal amount due on each of those series, it comes to about $39 million. Now, it's important to understand the security for those bonds. And forgive me if I'm telling you something that you know, but it's worth the refresher because as we talk about the keys to success, it's going to be important to have a firm grasp of the security. So the security for the bonds in each case, security for the bonds of refunding in each case, is first and foremost the project revenues. And the project revenues are the incremental increase in taxes within the redevelopment district. So the incremental increase in property taxes, sales taxes. There are also some special purpose sales taxes from special purpose districts, and in some cases there's also the annual lease payments from the Bass Pro Store. So that's the first place that we look when we want to pay the debt service on these outstanding bonds, and will be the same on the refunding bonds. Now, if those project revenues are insufficient to pay the debt service, then we look to the city's annual appropriation pledge. And this is a pledge by the city to each year consider appropriating from any legally available funds any amount necessary to make up any difference between the project revenues and the annual debt service. Next slide. So in this chart, what I'm showing you is this is the condition that we are trying to get to through the refunding. And in this case, you can see what we're doing is we're tailoring the annual debt service to the projected revenues. And we do that through refunding that with a lower interest rates, through extension of the debt for an additional 5 years, and just a respreading of the principal amount. Now, going back to my point about the success of this having to do with the city's ability to appropriate each year that amount necessary to make up any difference. The city, of course, already has a history of appropriating for the payment of Cracker Neck Creek debt obligations, about $18 million to date. To make this work, what we're talking about doing is leveraging the quote unquote new revenue from retiring TIF projects. And Brian alluded to this a moment ago. What we're talking about doing is as we have TIF districts that are terminated, we would then identify the city's share, and only the city's share, of the incremental taxes that otherwise would return to the general fund or special purpose, revenue funds. And we would redirect that or set it aside, earmark it, for repayment of the Cracker Neck Creek related debt, if necessary. The incremental revenues of the other taxing districts would, of course, flow to those taxing districts as planned. In addition to pulling from those that terminate, we're also looking at an early payoff and termination of the Drum Farm TIF, which would, of course, assist with this effort. Now, there's a word of art here that I'm going to introduce here, and you'll see it when you look at the official statement as well. And so these voluntarily redirected taxes from the terminating TIF districts are referred to in the documents, and I'll refer to them here, as the non-dedicated appropriation sources. I know that's a mouthful, but it's a term that I'm sure you'll become familiar. Next slide. So anyone looking at this transaction, whether it's the rating agencies or a potential investor, they're going to recognize that the pledged revenues, the project revenues, have historically been insufficient to pay all the debt service and are likely to continue to do so. So the attention is really going to be on these non-dedicated appropriation sources. And towards that end, we think that one of the keys to success for this transaction, for this refunding transaction, is to have a viable, clearly understandable plan for how we're going to identify those non-dedicated appropriation sources and allocate. And the plan that we are recommending to you is what we are calling a TIF sinking fund policy. Next slide. This has a abbreviated version of a table that the Finance and Audit Committee saw. It indicates that there are some outstanding TIF redevelopment districts that are in good shape, and there are some where there adjustments are needed, obviously Cracker Neck Creek being one of them. And I want to underscore that this TIF sinking fund policy is a key for the Cracker Neck Creek plan, but it also will address all of the outstanding TIF districts. So we see this as a 5-year forecast. So essentially what we would be doing is forecasting out at least 5 years and looking out and saying, okay, how much of the debt service do we think we can pay from the project revenues? And then allows us to identify, okay, what is the delta? What is the amount that we need, if any, above the project revenues from these non-dedicated appropriation sources in order to pay the full debt service. And then identifying that, putting it into a plan, bringing it before you with the annual budget each year so that you can review it and then make whatever appropriation you feel is necessary in order to be in a position to pay the debt service each year. And most importantly, memorializing that plan so that future council members and future staff members will have that as a reference point and a starting point each year. I think that concludes my comments. Brian, would you like me to take questions now, or should we wait until after David?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to ask the question that is always the first question asked when we do this presentation on Cracker Neck Creek and the many times that we've refinanced these bonds and had these discussions for however many years this has been going on. You mentioned that this is voluntary, that this would be a voluntary action by the council to pledge basically the proceeds of retired TIFs to the bond payments at Cracker Neck Creek. The school district will get paid back, or they will not get paid back. The school district will start collecting the increment, the county will start collecting the increment, the library district will start collecting the increment, but the city will not start collecting the increment. We will pledge these proceeds to the debt. So here's the question. What if we don't? What happens if we default on this debt?
Sure. Well, defaulting on the debt, and if you've observed what's happened with Platte County, that is basically an illustration where Platte County chose not to appropriate for the parking garage at Zona Rosa. The first thing that will happen is that, the city's bond rating will fall into the junk category. And that has the long-term effect of making it very expensive for the city to borrow funds in the future. And it will take a number of years. Moberly, Missouri, you may know, did something similar with the artificial sweetener plant that wasn't built. And it took them many, many years before they were able to recover their rating. So it has that long-term impact.
Thank you. Mr. Kidney, do you want to proceed and take, I'm sure there'll be more questions, but would you like to move on?
I think with Dave Martin with Gilmore Health, I think just go ahead and finish up with the action items and then we can get back to any structured questions or any other items.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Brian. As you mentioned, this is David Martin with Gilmore and Bell. I serve as bond counsel and economic development counsel to the city and have been working with the finance team here for over a year now on the structuring of this transaction. And we are reaching a point where we are close to being able to bring it in front of council. We've got the documentation and the underlying analysis in such a place where we should be in front of council, I would say within the next month, maybe 2 months. And we will be bringing a package of items in front of council for approval. So to step back to the action item bullet list, there's a couple of them that we have already achieved or are in process. So engaging an underwriter, Goldman Sachs has been engaged for that period of time I discussed and has been working with us to structure this transaction. Complete the process of structuring the bonds and the documentation. We're nearing the completion of that process. And then when we come in front of council with this package that I discussed, it's going to encompass a number of things. The most obvious of which is passing a bond ordinance that will authorize the finance team to actually complete the financing and market the financing to investors. We're going to be asking for the adoption of the tax increment financing sinking fund policy that was just discussed. As part of and as sort of the first stage of implementing the TIF sinking fund policy, we will be putting in front of you the defeasance and termination of the Drum Farm TIF. And so Drum Farm will be sort of ground zero for the implementation of voluntarily redirecting revenues that were previously captured by tax increment financing districts. And then after authorization of those items, the finance team will proceed to market and sell the bonds, and we'll move towards a closing, at which point the 3 bond issuances identified by Tom will be taken out by a refunding issue that will achieve debt service savings compared to the 3 prior issues. So the main portion of my discussion tonight is going to be with respect to what happens and what are the requirements and restrictions involved in issuing bonds to what we refer to as the capital market, basically going out and soliciting investors to purchase bonds in $5,000 increments and piecing out a large borrowing in that manner in order to, typically the idea is, achieve a lower borrowing cost. So when bonds are issued in that fashion, they are governed by the Securities and Exchange Commission's rules. It has two main rules that we'll be discussing tonight, the first of which is Rule 15C212. And that's sort of the overarching rule that requires the production of what you might think of in the corporate world as a prospectus. It's referred to as an official statement in the municipal world. And that is what has been included in your document packets. And you'll notice if you look to the official statement version that was included for your review, it's referred to as a preliminary official statement. So the way this functions in practice is that the finance team assembles a preliminary official statement for review by the city and its staff and the finance team. And then when it has been reviewed and approved, the finance team delivers that official statement. The underwriter shops it basically to potential investors, gets a response from the investors, sizes the market, and then sets what we refer to as a pricing, which fills in a lot of the blanks that you see in the draft of the preliminary official statement. Things like the ultimate term of the financing, the individual yields and prices for each of the maturity of the bonds, and the redemption provisions are included at that time. And this is a practice that's followed in most of the city's financings that have been done to date. It is applicable to bond issuances that are over $1 million in principal amount and are not privately placed with a single bank purchaser. So the second rule that I want to talk about, and this is more implementation of how the official statement has to be produced and reviewed. This is Rule 10b-5, and this is the rule that states that it is unlawful to make an untrue statement of material fact or omit to state a material fact necessary in order to make the statements that are made in light of the circumstances not misleading. So basically this puts on the city and its staff a duty to make sure that when it puts out a preliminary official statement and then a final official statement, the information that includes is not by itself misleading and doesn't fail to include something that would make it misleading by virtue of that failure. And so that's why we have included this document in your packets and why we encourage the council members to read through the document and bring to Brian specifically, but city staff's attention, anything that might be known to you but not others as far as making either a material misstatement or being necessary to avoid a misstatement. Brian, do you want to jump to the next slide? So this slide and the next slide simply include examples from the draft document that you have in front of you. And I will also point out page numbers on the document if you do have it up on your screens or printed out in front of you so that you can reference these sections. So starting on page 9, at the bottom of page 9, there is a disclosure section entitled the Cracker Neck Creek Project. And as we're going through this, you'll see that these, I've kind of pointed out the most, or some of the most obvious and material sections that would be important to an investor if that investor was considering a purchase of these bonds. And so the Cracker Neck Creek Project discusses the formation of the tax increment financing redevelopment area. It talks about the Bass Pro lease, and it has a discussion of the square footage and the type of retailers and restaurants and the Stony Creek Inn that are within the redevelopment area as a way of providing background to the investor so that they can see what drives the project revenues that Tom was referring to. The next section that I want to point out, it starts at the middle of page 10, and it addresses the city's general fund. And that is important to this transaction. As Tom mentioned, this transaction is backed not only by project revenues, but similar to pretty much all of the city's bond transactions that are outstanding, is backed by an annual appropriation pledge as well. And so the investor wants to see and is interested in the health of the city's general fund in order to determine the value of that annual appropriation pledge. So as you flip through that section, you'll see that there's some general discussion about the general fund, the revenues from the prior fiscal year. There are tables that show 5 years of general fund balances and expenditures and change in the ending fund balance. There's a balance sheet summary. And then there's some discussion about the operating budget so that the investor can see what the city thinks is going to happen ultimately with respect to ending fund balance at the end of the fiscal year that we're currently in. So there's another table that shows 2 years of general fund budgets and results, and then shows the 2021 budget. And then we have some discussion about post-budget developments, since obviously there have been some changes that could not have been anticipated at the time that the budget was approved. We talk about what actually happened with the interfund loan that was approved but has yet to be drawn on. We talk about sales tax anticipations and the fact that sales tax collections were better than anticipated. And we discuss the Jackson County distribution of CARES Act funds. The next section that I want to point out, and it's on the next slide, Brian, but I don't know if that's particularly important, if it's difficult to pop up there. The next section that I want to talk about is the anticipated revenue sources. And this is what Tom was focusing on when he discussed 1, project revenues, and then 2, the non-dedicated appropriation revenues. On page 16, this section begins. It's several pages long. Probably the best snapshot is to look at page 17. And on page 17, we have included a table that discusses all of the types of revenues that are anticipated to be sources of either pledge or appropriation to the repayment of the proposed 2021 bonds. And so the most protected or dedicated of those are referred to as pledged revenues. These are revenues that by law the city is capable of directly pledging to a series of bonds in a manner that makes the city unable to change its mind basically about that application. So the payment in lieu of tax, the state TIF revenues, and the transportation development district revenues fall into that category. Then the rest of the revenues are subject to appropriation by the city in some manner. So there's other project revenues, which are the Bass Pro lease payments. There are the EATs, and they're the I-70 Little Blue Parkway revenues, which have been structured in a fashion that they are also available for the assistance of debt service on the Crackerneck Creek bonds. And then the block other and the other appropriation sources are really what Tom was discussing when he was talking about the sinking fund policy. These are the sources that would be directed to the sinking fund as opposed to being directed to specific tax funds of the city in which they would normally be collected. So the rest of that section is really just more detailed discussion for each of those different revenue sources. So then I want to jump pretty far down into the body of the preliminary official statement and discuss one item that has been.
I'm sorry, David, let me interrupt you for a minute, and just so because this is a lot of information. So as I'm following along on this, the page that you just referenced, I'm sorry, I'm flipping from screen to screen on page 17. on 17. So the pledged revenues, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. That's just basic TIF, usual stuff. The other appropriated sources, when you talk about these non-dedicated appropriation sources, which are the voter-approved streets tax, parks tax, stormwater tax, and health and recreation property tax fund. I know you're not here to make a recommendation. You're just here to tell us what other sources might be available. But Mr. Kidney, would that, we, to my knowledge, have we utilized portions of those taxes in the past for the Cracker Nut Creek development? I know over time, originally we were paying all, this goes back, over 15 years. We were paying entirely out of the general fund, and then we started charging some of this to our enterprise funds, not tourism, but the utilities, since the utilities were part of the development. I mean, that's neither here nor there for this discussion, but that's what happened. So now these non-dedicated appropriation sources, which are some, not all, of our voter-approved sales taxes for specific purposes, is this just to demonstrate that that's something we could do, or is that we have never done that, correct?
The only expenses that we would have ever been able to take out of those funds are for those expenses that would have answered the question that the vote was correct. The vote was actually done. So the only way we would be able to use any of these funds in this redirect is if there were any of, for instance, if there were street improvements in that area that were paid for with the debt issue that could have been paid for with the street improvement fund, or if there's in the same with the stormwater. The big redirect that we would see on this would be, it kind of goes back up here to the general fund. The general fund portion of these, all of that would be able to be allocated then to the repayment of these bonds. But the special ones, you'd only be able to use those to the extent that the original issue had those type of expenditures in those.
And only council approval for the appropriation.
So in this scenario, the council would be appropriating all of these through that annual special allocation fund, that sinking fund. Okay. So I want to stop. Just Dave, I just want to make sure I said that correctly on the special funds.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind here is the city, as you all know, has supplemented the debt service, especially the last time that there was a real imbalance before some refinancing spread debt service out. So that there was supplementing that was done from the general fund, from utility funds, and from certain sales tax funds. But what we're talking about here is a little bit different than that. It does take monies that would have otherwise been deposited into those special tax funds, but these sources didn't exist previous to really right now because they are generated by expiring tax increment financing districts, and we're just starting to see a lot of the tax increment financing districts come into a sunset horizon where we can identify these revenues. So before they were, when you were supplementing the debt service, it was just being taken out of those special funds and directly paid. In this circumstance, you are intercepting new revenues that could have gone to those special funds and depositing it into a sinking fund so that it can be used for that payment. The idea is we're trying to come up with a plan that prevents a net reduction or required payment from those funds compared to what was previously experienced. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, so I'll move down to a federal investigation of certain transactions, which has become an important part of the disclosure on this transaction due to the general knowledge of what's happened with some FBI and grand jury subpoena requests that the city has experienced over the last year. And this particular section describes both that subpoena and subsequent FBI requests, and then also tries to relate that back to the two transactions that those requests appear to be targeting, that being the solar farm golf course transaction and the Missouri City power plant demolition transaction. And so it will be very important in connection with this transaction for the 2020 bonds that we accurately represent what has been requested and what the city is aware of with respect to that circumstance. And that brings us to the end of my presentation. And I think Tom has maybe one or two more slides, or are we going directly to questions?
Madam Mayor?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Martin. Looks like to me, first of all, I don't like the word sinking funds. That's doesn't really sit real good with me. And number two, it looks like we're robbing Peter to pay Paul on this project. So that's all I have to say on this one.
Okay. Are there other
Gentlemen?
comments or questions?
Yeah, Madam
We
Mayor.
have more. Excuse me. I'm sorry, Mr. Councilman Hobart. I'm sorry, Mr. Kidney. Is there more to the presentation, or is that the, okay?
I think we're good. We're ready to take any questions you might
Okay,
have.
Councilman Hobart.
This is a bigger picture question, but if we don't do this, what are our options?
So I'll refer you back to the slide that Tom had showed earlier that showed that there were more expenditures than revenues available. If we were not to restructure this, then the city would need to take those excess payments out of the general fund in order to make those payments.
Which we don't have the money to do.
Correct.
Madam Mayor?
Yes,
Thank you. Sir, is it possible, for example, the non-dedicated appropriation sources, the street, parks, stormwater, health and recreation, is it possible to adopt everything else except that section and have this program fly? Or is one section dependent on the other and it's an all or nothing proposition?
So it is possible to move forward. Well, I don't know if it's marketable, but it is legally and theoretically possible to move forward with a transaction that doesn't include those other appropriation sources and doesn't, or at least the non-dedicated appropriation sources, and doesn't involve the sinking fund policy, or however you want to refer to that fund, doesn't involve that policy. However, as Brian mentioned, that would require significant funds to be taken from elsewhere, and the only likely target is the general fund in order to try to cover that gap. And there simply is not, on the projected estimations, enough money available in the general fund to do that.
And where it says it's a source of annual appropriation by the city, I'm just not clear on how that would work. Like, for example, the stormwater sales tax. Do we make a decision in 2021 that 15% of the bond cost originally dealt with stormwater? and therefore it's 15% of the payments we should get from stormwater? Is that what you're saying?
That's the general idea you're expressing is correct.
Okay.
The implementation is that in two parts. One is that this policy is designed to provide a review of this on an annual basis in advance of when you adopt the budget. And so calculations will be done every year. And the first calculation would be, do we think we're going to be short on debt service on Cracker Neck? And the next calculation would be how much revenue can we apply from each of these different individual special fund sources? How much revenue is there from this redirect policy? And then how much can be applied legally? And that would be used to come up with a recommendation for the subsequent fiscal year of, we think that we should capture X dollars from this fund, from expiring TIFs, X dollars from that fund, and be condensed into a recommendation to council. And then that appropriation would be made in connection with the budget to hold those revenues for the next fiscal year.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Madam Mayor, Mr. Martin, I saw in some of the materials that there is some sort of legal ceiling or amount that is that would minimize or control how much we can spend from those separate taxes. Is that right? Is
Correct.
there a legal? So are we we would need to get a legal opinion on whether the recommended amount from each tax each year fits within that, or at least the recommendation we would get would include a legal opinion for that?
Not necessarily a legal opinion, but your bond and economic development council, myself, will be involved in those discussions. I've already been involved in helping the finance team put together a fairly complicated spreadsheet that allows them to make those calculations. And so what's going to be turned over in connection with the closing of this transaction to city staff is a model that can be used that incorporates those limitations as have already been calculated, and they'll be able to plug in data from the current year and then determine what the limits would be for that next fiscal year. So we're not going to be in a situation where this is getting turned loose and we're forgetting about the legal limitations on the expenditures from those funds.
Okay. Good, thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilman Steinmeier.
I'm kind of like with Councilman Member Huff, the sinking fund policy. Who came up with this name? I mean, this is the most rosy, beautiful name for this albatross around this city's name. Who came up with the sinking fund policy name?
I will say, and I know Tom was going to speak up there, but I would say the name came from the fact that that's what it is in. If you look up bond language, I mean, that is what it's called, is a sinking fund. So I took to try to find who defined originally what sinking fund is. It is a technical term. I would say before it used to be called honeypot, and I didn't like that one. So we asked them
that one better.
Okay. I think we could work with the name of. We could work with the name of the policy.
We can work with the name.
I think it's absolutely appropriate for this albatross that's been hung around the taxpayer's neck. That this is a sinking fund. I'm curious. Did we, Madam Mayor, when you asked the question, you know, what would happen if we just don't pay this? How long, in terms of years, is this going to have a negative impact on us as a city?
How long is what going to
have a negative impact on our credit rating as a city?
If we do this transaction?
No, if we walked away from this.
If we walked away.
Said, we're done with this.
That's a difficult. Yeah. That's a difficult question to answer. It does vary depending on the other characteristics of the community. If you're a community that has otherwise extremely strong characteristics, it's a wealthy community, big fund balance, high property values, it's a lot easier to bounce back. If you're a community that isn't as fortunate, it can take a little lower, and it depends also on the activities that take place. The rating agencies will be looking for corrective actions. So there's a number of things, but I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I think Moberly just got their rating raised, and I think it was down for, oh my gosh, it's got to be 6 to 8 years, I think, in their case.
I think that it was around 7 years before Moberly was able to issue any type of debt. Yeah. In terms of annual appropriation after that. And that, I believe, was a direct placement. So they still were not able to access the capital markets at that time. So it's a long-term effect. And I think that it's important to consider one thing that is specific to the city is that all of its bonds that have been issued do have this annual appropriation component. So if you were to enter into a circumstance where there was a failure to appropriate, it would affect not only the city's economic development bonds, it would affect utility bonds and some general municipal bonds that have been issued. The city has a lot of debt outstanding, and it is going to want to, over the next several years, refund for debt service savings portions of that debt, and that would all be significantly affected by a failure to appropriate.
Okay, Mr. Martin, when did this debt first begin? Was it 2006?
The earliest outstanding is from 2006, yes.
And basically all we're making is interest payments, and that's what we've done for the last 15 years?
Not for 15 years. So there was a period of time.
Years. How about 13 years? Well,
it's basically since about 2012, 2013, when the debt service, the principal started coming due on some of the bonds that were outstanding at that time. And then a series of refundings were undertaken over the next few years that essentially put that off into the future with the idea that somebody was going to have to come back and provide a fix down the road when that principal started to become due again.
Okay,
and
so
that's where we are now.
Well, okay, so we're at this point now where we know that the progress that's being made is not adequate on this tip, right? I mean, we don't really have a plan. I think I read that you're saying the general fund, you're projecting it is going to be down something like 21% in this report. That's a big number. I'm just trying to justify doing all of this bond refunding. You know who's doing well off of our bond refunding is the investors. That's who's doing well. They're making money on this, and they would love to see us just carry this in well, I can't think of the word now, but you just keep going on forever with this. They'll just keep making money on us, and we'll just be hanging a bigger and bigger and bigger debt around our children's, our grandchildren's neck, with no real plan to get this managed or taken care of. And so at some point we have to look at it and say, either we got to come up with a really substantial plan to be serious about getting this paid off, or the possibility of walking away and taking our lumps. I don't know what else we can do, but I'm looking at the other bonds that are going to be coming up. They're big. They're very big. And so I think we've got to have a better plan than just having a sinking fund and taking monies from streets that we can use on our streets and in our parks and other places. We need a better plan than this one, I think, if we're going to be serious about tackling this. But I don't know how we're going to do it. I think it's something that we inherited as a council. It's maybe we can just classify it as the sins of the past policy. maybe we should do that. But we need to be serious about what the best course of action really is at this point.
Well, I'll let Tom and maybe Brian respond to this, but when you talk about a plan that identifies how the debt can be extinguished, that's what this is. I mean, this is the result of 2 years of analysis and running models and taking in information and applying it in a manner, the ultimate goal of which was to minimize the ongoing effect on the city's general fund and to identify a group of revenues that will allow the city to ultimately pay these bonds off. And so this plan is what has been identified for that purpose.
It feels like more of a refunding plan. I mean, that's what we're really discussing, though.
Well, and it is, and that's a crucial component because of two things. One, we need to reduce the interest rates, and that the refunding will accomplish that. And two, unlike a simple bank loan where you might be able to just renegotiate the terms of the loan in terms of what debt service comes due at what time, with bonds, you don't have that ability when you have numerous bondholders out in the capital market. So the bonds that are currently outstanding, there is not a palatable way to pay the scheduled debt service on those bonds. That schedule that Tom showed that has a large hump in debt service coming up starting 2 years from now, that's what we're trying to address with the refunding. We're trying to reduce that hump, level out debt service, and identify revenues that can be applied to that debt service.
You know, let me just share with you a little anecdote from this whole process, which maybe is helpful. I remember one of the first discussions we had, and so this is city staff, representatives of Gilmore and Bell, representatives of Baker Tilly, and we were sitting and we were working hard to find alternatives to address this. And we talked about the fact that any lasting solution was going to require some real fiscal diligence and constraint. And that it would also need to be something that was closely monitored to be able to make changes for changing conditions. And that's how we arrived at the solution, you know, that we brought forth. And it will be, you know, difficult. Each year when you sit down to consider what the appropriations will have to be to balance, you know, to add to the pledged revenues to make the debt service payments, there will be difficult decisions to be made. So I echo David's comment that, you know, I think this is a viable solution, but it won't be easy.
Well,
may I ask a question? Why are only some of the special taxing funds identified and not all?
The simple answer to that question is not all of the purposes of special taxing funds aligned with the uses in the project. So one of the first things that we did is we looked at all of the project expenditures that came out of bond proceeds.
They don't require any police or fire?
Well, but it's not that. So bonds don't fund services in terms of police and fire. They fund improvements, and they want police or fire improvements.
Okay, very good. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? I'm sorry, Brian, did I interrupt you?
No, I just wanted to say that, so that's our presentation. I would like to say and echo Mr. Calico and Mr. Martin is, I remember very specifically those early meetings, and I've talked to this council before about this has been on my radar the day I showed up here, and I really wanted to make sure that this was the council that had the answer, that was able to stop kicking the can down the road and actually have a solution. And so one of the boundaries that I set on this financing was to protect the general fund as much as possible, but also don't make a future finance director or future council have to, again, deal with this. Not saying that we're not going to have fixes or adjustments to this going down the road, but we really hope we brought to you, and I'd say this team, Dave and Tom, and obviously Vanessa and her team really brought, I think, a very solid plan for a really bad situation.
One more uncomfortable question. You briefly talked about the request from the FBI for documentation on some projects that had nothing to do with Crackerneck Creek. So why is that relevant, other than it may impact people's confidence in just the city in general?
So the relevance is that if the ultimate outcome of that were so negative that it cost the city a great deal of money, or if it had been directly related to Crackerneck Creek, if it affected those revenues directly, or any of the revenue streams that we show as the non-dedicated appropriation sources, then it would be something that would be absolutely critical to the repayment of the investors. It's something that's out there in the public domain, and in order to avoid having the SEC come back at some point in the future and say, we think this was important enough that you should have disclosed it, the finance team feels that it's necessary to include that as part of the initial disclosure.
So I'm not all that familiar with, or I'm not familiar at all with the grand jury investigation that you referenced. Is the city involved with that, or is that what are the documents that have been requested? I know there have been sunshine requests made; those are part of the public record. But has there been any, action taken?
The city has responded to the various document requests and has basically provided mostly ordinances, resolutions, minutes, and some backup information that would have been included in board packets.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Then we will move on to our next. Does anybody need a little break? We could take a 5-minute recess, or we could just keep going. All right, we'll just keep moving. IPL update on combustion turbine replacement and generation.
All right, so I'll be quick with the intro. We're still early in our process with relative to the replacement of the combustion turbines, but Jim provided some information to update the council on where we are in that process. And I know I shared a memo earlier today about kind of some of the questions we received over the last week or so and our responses to those questions. I know there is one or two in there that we need to work on and clarify a little bit. So I just want to give you a heads up about that before we would make that part of the discussion on the agenda item itself to post it. So with that, I'll kick it over to Jim. I think he's just going to stand for questions unless there's specific things we need to cover in the presentation itself.
Good evening, Mayor, council members. Just in the interest of time, I know we're late. I only had just a couple of slides, and they were pretty basic and to the point. So with your permission, I'll just skip the slides and get right to the information. Following the council's decision in January to go ahead and pursue generation solutions. The IPL staff have started working on assembling a request for proposals that we can send out to bid. One of the problems that we're running into is it is so broad-based that in order to describe something that bidders could actually get their hands around and submit a bid that would be something we could evaluate fairly, it's going to take a tremendous amount of detail. We did get an example of an RFP that was issued by a California utility in excess of 400 pages. Another example is several hundred pages just to describe the different technologies and different options. I had directed the staff that we wanted to produce an RFP that does not exclude anything so that we could evaluate all the various options. That may be an approach that we're not going to be able to do. We may have to work with you all, the council, to maybe narrow that a little bit so that we can focus the RFP and put something out there that we can actually get some bids back from. So that's where we're at in the process. We have gotten further information from Southwest Power Pool. They are holding firm on their 4 to 5 year analysis of any proposals before they will be able to grant approval if it's new generation. If it's replacement generation, then there's still the option of the maybe a year to year and a half process to get through that. We do have an attorney on staff at MPUA who has suggested we might be able to leverage a request for replacement of Blue Valley, since they were establishing this program at the same time that we retired the plant, but they failed to tell us anything about it. We may be able to possibly use that to get some grace on being able to use the shortened process to replace something at Blue Valley. But again, the replacement program is an equal amount of megawatts. So, for example, Blue Valley 3 at 50 megawatts, we could propose replacing it with 50 megawatts. With the combustion turbines that are roughly 35 to 40 megawatts at a substation, we could recommend, or we could propose replacing the same amount of megawatts at those. So there are options that we have. There are some different timelines involved depending on the course that the council would choose to pursue. And I'll certainly be working with all of you to help refine that and help develop our course.
So let me, Mr. City Manager, let me ask a question. I don't want a 400-page RFP. Is there not another methodology that we could employ to get, I feel like there's several steps to this process. One is fully understanding what our options are in terms of, and Mr. Nails provide the council, and I know the PUAB, with some, very high level preliminary descriptions of some of the technologies that are out there that may be available to us. But is there, so that would be one step of a process. And then the other step would be the council deciding which of those, or a combination of those technologies, we determine would best suit our need for replacement. And then, perhaps at some later stage, augmenting that with new generation when the Southwest Power Pool makes that option available to us. I mean, I'm just, this is just back of the envelope type stuff. Could we employ a couple of different tactics in order to not try to put all of this into one request for proposal, which then, I want everybody to keep in mind, we've done plenty of RFPs that we didn't like the responses, and we didn't we don't have any obligation to act on any of them. There's no preconceived determination of what the outcome of this is going to be, but it seems to me like it would involve perhaps a couple different uses of our tools we have available for us to gather information before we start bidding on things that we're not even sure that that's what where the community wants us to go.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We probably need to narrow some of these choices down and options before we get too far into any kind of solicitation or selection process. We need to come back and likely present several different options to the council to make an informed decision about which direction they want to go. Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think we have to, bite this all off at one time. Mr. Nail, I know the council likely has many questions for you regarding the events of the last couple of weeks. We are all receiving a lot of inquiries from our customers and the population in general about kind of what happened. And I know that's part of the document that you have been working on. So I'm gonna, open it up to comments and questions on this topic and, other things related to energy delivery and generation as it affects our IPL customers.
Certainly.
I've got a short request, Madam Mayor.
Yes.
I was thinking it might be smart to add a study session item to our next study session that where finance can present the debt that IPL has and that the city has generally. We're looking at power generation that's going to involve some debt obligation. So I'd like to add that to the next available study session.
That's fine. I mean, those documents were included in our packet for tonight.
Somewhat. They don't. There's. In addition to that.
And I know it's late, and we don't want to necessarily jump into that whole discussion, but so that's fine if you want to postpone that part of the discussion.
I'd like to. In addition, Mr. Kidney and Mr. Norris, if we can get a rundown of our investments in the other power plants and bond issues that we've got hanging out there, just so we have a generalized idea of what that is. And Mr. Nail, for some time down the road, I'd really like to know too. Again, we don't have to do it tonight, but how much those plants ran and that kind of thing.
Certainly.
But
Madam Mayor.
I'm not looking to go on.
So, excuse me, hang on. Councilman Hobart, I just want to make sure that when you have what you're looking for, we did get in our packet for tonight the outstanding utility debt for all the utilities, and then the document that tells us, where we're buying our power from and and how much it's costing us. Is there something additional that you want beyond what's in here in regards to what your questions about the debt and the expenses?
Yeah, I'd like to see essentially profitability of the other plants that we've invested in.
Okay.
So on top of that, we got the CAFR last week, and it's a significant document, and I've read a chunk of it, but some of those numbers are in there. But I'd really rather that staff do a small presentation on it to make sure I understand it.
That sounds good.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Mr. City Manager, Mr. Nail, it's come to my attention that Onetta, which we have an agreement with, that we signed in the first quarter of 2019 that Onetta sold in quarter 4 of 2019. Were you aware of that? Either one of you?
I know there was a change in the name of the operating company, and those documents were provided to the city to get new signatures.
Okay, so
the agreement itself did not change.
Okay, so we do have an ovation from them?
Yes.
Who has that?
Should be on file with the city.
Oh, I inquired. I haven't got anything back from the city on any novation. So I think it's important that we look at the agreement along with the novation to make sure there was in fact no changes, because they obviously didn't perform what we paid for. So I'd like for us to look at that, and also we need to review the SPP contract and the agreement that we have, and make sure that we understand what their obligation to us as customers, what it is, and did they fulfill it. And so I'd like for us to start looking at that, and we can have more discussions on that. But
sure.
I would like to see the novation, because nobody seems to know if we have that or not.
So maybe this would be more what Councilman Hobart's asking for in a couple weeks, because I do agree that we should, because there's council members now who weren't here when we executed that contract, and it would be a good time, I think, to review what we are paying for there. And it's certainly on this document, just briefly, that you supplied. But while we're at it, why don't we review our coal contracts as well, and make sure that everybody understands those, and get into more detail, as well as Dogwood, which I understand has had a change in ownership as well. So, if we're going to be providing some detail on that and understanding of the terms of those, and perhaps our negotiating position, if there is any, we can add those to the next study session and get into more detail.
Certainly.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Councilman.
I need a little clarification here with Mr. Nell and the city manager. Actually, what we're talking about is replacement. We're not talking about building a power plant. We're talking about replacing the 92 megs that we have to do. And so all these people have got involved, a couple council people here that, have got really into this thing, which is fun. I welcome them. But we're not talking about building a power plant. We're talking about replacing what we have. And this has been on the list for quite a few years. As an employee for 35 years in executive management, it's not like that I was out here sweeping floors, that this has always been a big deal to Power and Light. And I'm sure Mr. Nell knows that. We're talking about replacement. I did want to throw something in here, because I read the newspaper today, and all of a sudden there's a lot of experts out there. But I didn't know if Mr. Nell or the city manager knew the reason why Dogwood didn't run, and this is part of the Onetta thing, is because the gas company demanded $100 million for 3 days of gas. So the representatives of these cities decided to shut it down rather than run. And I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but otherwise there wouldn't be no blackouts for us or BPU. It was a choice made by them at $100 million, and I understand their situation there. This is a huge, huge thing for this city. It should not be taken lightly by anyone. This is very, very important. And to say that we're building a power plant is incorrect. I don't know where these people are getting this. I don't know where they're getting $500 million. I have no clue what they're talking about. Actually, my plan or ideas, which is up to the council, of course, is that we take our capital budget, which before Mr. Norris was the other assistant city manager, which enlightened me on how we figure out our capital projects, which was it really intrigued me because I didn't realize that. Even being an employee for 35 years in upper management, I didn't realize how they figured out capital projects. It's done on depreciation. So I see all these numbers and I hear all this riffraff out there. What my thoughts are, and I've discussed this with the mayor and other council members, is that we take these capital projects, which is average $15 million a year, we freeze them for 5 years. Okay. So unless there's an emergency, which evidently we have $67 million in a reserve, that we should be able to handle any kind of emergency. But if we freeze our capital projects like every other division in the city other than the utilities, that we take that, and if you take that times 5 and you figure that all out, you figure out that we will sell some power. I mean, we're at risk. Yeah, no one's doubting that. But inevitably, I don't think that this will cost the ratepayers, which I read today, that's going to be a ratepayers increased rates in this city. I really think myself personally that we're going to decrease rates by looking into this. And like I said, I've never been an expert, never claimed to be one, but we have a little common sense here. Things are deteriorating. Coal, we shut down a nuclear plant in Nebraska. We've had numerous coal plants shut down. So we are, for a base load, we are in jeopardy, and adverse conditions. I'm not saying that windmills, solar panels are not good, because I believe that we need that in our portfolio. And I'm in. I think technology, if we wait a little longer, we'll probably be better off. But we really need to look at now and run from there. But I've nowhere ever said that renewables are bad. I think technology will improve them, but I really think that we need to really jump all over this thing and figure out what road we want to take. Between the capital project freeze, like I said, like every other department in the city has done, reduction in force, sale of power. I honestly do not think that this will cause any kind of rate increase in this city. It actually should be a decrease. So that's all I have.
Okay, are there any comments or questions for Mr. Naylor, city manager, on this evening? We'll get into the financials at the next study session. Okay, then we will move on to our boards and commissions report. Madam City Clerk.
Thank you. Give me just a second here. First board is the Independence Economic Development and Incentive Commission. We're looking to reappoint Martin Cooney and to appoint Quentin Templeton. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection to adding this to the next council agenda? Okay, hearing none, you can proceed with that one, Madam City Clerk.
Thank you. TIF Commission, looking to add a resolution to appoint Jacob John, and we can add a resolution to the next agenda if there's no objections.
Are there any objections? Okay, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Thank you. Japanese Sister City Committee, Daniela Book. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Are there any objections? Okay, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Okay, Public Safety Tax Oversight Committee. We're looking to appoint Patrick Casey. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Are there any objections? Okay, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Street Improvement Oversight Committee, we're looking to appoint Jerry Adkins. If there's no objections, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Okay, are there any objections? You can add that to the next agenda.
And then finally, Brand Independence Committee, we're looking to reappoint Michelle Crumbaugh and Quentin Templeton, as well as Meredith Parrish and Angie Judy. And if there's no objections, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Okay, are there any objections? Then you can proceed with adding that to the next agenda.
Thank you.
Okay, and there are some individual appointments. I know I have a couple of my own that I need to fill, so if you are like me, please be working on those. Mr. City Manager, is there anything else this evening? Okay, we are adjourned.